ways you can own a property in the UK. Most common is joint tenants, where co-owners have an interest in the whole property. If one dies, the surviving partner becomes sole owner. This is Mr. and Mrs. Smith, a married couple who live with their son James in their own house. If Mr. Smith dies, the house passes entirely to Mrs. Smith. This might seem to be appropriate, but let's look at the consequences. Later on, Mrs. Smith meets Mr. Jones, who also has a child of his own. Mrs. Smith marries Mr. Jones, becoming Mrs. Jones. Sadly, Mrs. Jones passes away without making a will. Her entire estate now passes to Mr. Jones under the intestacy rules. And when Mr. Jones passes away, the house follows his bloodline, going to his son. Meaning Mr. Smith's son, James, doesn't inherit anything, something Mr. Smith would not want to happen. But there is a solution. You can own the property as tenants in common. This means Mr. and Mrs. Smith own the house on a 50-50 basis. If one person dies, their half of the house passes into their estate. So if Mr. Smith dies, his share of the property passes into a protective property trust set up by his will. Then James will ultimately inherit his father's share of the property when his mother dies. But Mrs. Smith has full use of the house whilst alive. And if Mrs. Smith marries Mr. Jones, Mr. Smith's share of the property is still held for his son and not passed on to anyone else.